Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be breaking down the Sunday, February 4th slate of college basketball DFS on DraftKings as well as FanDuel. The scheduling has been very favorable to us. We've got a 6 p.m. start for a Sunday slate tomorrow, which is quite different from what we're used to. We've been getting these noon and 1 p.m. starts, but now we've got a 6 p.m. start, which is going to give us a full day to kind of digest everything and, take a look at all the options that we've got for these four games. So if you're watching this on Sunday before the slate starts, welcome. Glad to have you. And I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to give you guys all the information you need in this episode to build winning lineups for this Sunday college basketball DFS slate. It's a 4-game slate on DraftKings and a 3-game slate on FanDuel. It has been a great Saturday for me personally. I got to go to Charlotte to watch my Charlotte 49ers beat ECU. First Charlotte basketball game I've attended since I graduated from there 7 years ago. And then simultaneously, my Texas Longhorns got a big-time road win against TCU. And so it was a great Saturday, and we're hoping to make it a great Sunday. Now, none of my teams are playing on Sunday, so the only way we can make it a great Sunday is by winning some money in DFS. If you like what you see here on this channel, please hit the like button for the video. It really does help me out a lot. And if you're listening on audio, please rate and review. I promise those do not fall on deaf ears. I really do appreciate it, and it really does help. And if you're new or if you're a long-time listener and follower, please hit the subscribe button. That way you can be notified when new episodes drop, and you can be with us for the rest of college basketball season all the way up until March Madness. All right, so let's go ahead and end the introduction there. Let's go ahead and start talking about game number 1 of this slate, a battle in the Big East between Providence and Villanova. All right, so the first game is between Providence and Villanova, and this is not the game on the slate that you want to be targeting. I would not recommend game stacking this game. This one is the lowest total of the slate between the 4 games. It is projected to finish 68-65 according to KenPom. This one in favor of Villanova. Both these teams are really even in their KenPom metrics, so I really think Villanova is just getting the boost for home court, which makes sense. Now, when you look at it, these are not teams that play super slow. These are teams that put up a lot of fantasy points, but they're really good defensive teams. Both of them ranked top 50 in the nation in defensive efficiency. So maybe there's ways to get to guys in this game because there's going to be a lot of possessions. There's going to be a lot of rebounds, blocks, and steals, just not a whole lot of total points. So I do think there are ways for guys in this game to hit value. And let's start with the Providence side. So Devin Carter and Josh Aduru have both seen incredible usage since Bryce Hopkins has gone down. In fact, both Carter and Aduro have had a 28% usage rate in conference play. That's including the few games that Bryce Hopkins played. And both of them have a 36% usage rate against UConn. Both of them have just been really solid fantasy options. I think Aduru is a really solid matchup against Villanova. Villanova is not a very tall team. And so I think Aduru can kind of have his way down low. And then you look at Devin Carter, and he's just shown an incredible floor. Ever since Bryce Hopkins got injured, Carter has not had below 34.75 fantasy points. That is just kind of incredible because at his salary on DraftKings, that's almost 4x value. And on FanDuel, which by the way, the FanDuel pricing for the Sunday slate is super interesting. They did not really price guys up like I thought they would. It's looking like it's going to be very easy to build a lineup on FanDuel because of just where everybody's priced at. And I think that Carter and Aduro are two of the best priced guys on the slate on FanDuel. And I think they're very affordable for their price tag. Now, after those two guys eat so much of the usage that it's kind of hard to get to any other Providence guys, and I probably wouldn't recommend playing any other Providence guys as one-offs. I would probably pick one of Carter and Aduro and then try to figure out which other guy goes off. You have Ticket Gaines and Jaden Pierre, who are both solid players. Every time I watch them, I think they're both good, but you don't really know when they're going to go off. In fact, they both need hot shooting nights to go off. You look at Ticket Gaines, he had a ceiling 40 fantasy point performance game against Seton Hall where he went 5 for 7 from behind the arc, put up 17, 6, 2 with 5 total blocks and steals. You look at Jaden Pierre, and he's in pretty much the same boat. His ceiling game was 28.5 against Creighton, where he had only 10 points, but 2 for 4 from behind the arc, had 4 steals in that game as well. So I just don't really think there's a likelihood that either of these two guys have a ceiling game, but hey, I think they're okay in terms of a stacking partner with Carter and Aduro. The guy I want to talk about, though, is Corey Floyd Jr. So we mentioned him at the start of when Bryce Hopkins got hurt, how he was going to be, thrust into this starting role and, could be a potential big-time breakout guy. Well, he hadn't really done a whole lot since the Seton Hall game. The Seton Hall game is when he filled in for Bryce Hopkins, and then after that, he was irrelevant for a while, but each of the last 2 games, he has picked it up. He had 17.75 fantasy points against Georgetown, 21 fantasy points against UConn in 31 and 32 minutes played. I think he's a super cheap piece that I don't know. I don't feel great trusting it, but like on DraftKings where there's not a whole lot of value to be had, I think you can go down there and play him at $4,100. Now, on the Villanova side, they are super interesting in my opinion because you got Eric Dixon, who like just if I can say this about Villanova, they have a lot of unique pieces that like don't really make sense, but like they kind of fit decently together. Like Eric Dixon is like a 6'7" center who is just like a built like a brick wall, and he all he wants to do is like shoot corner threes, and it's just really weird. Like he's got a really unique game, but he's got an incredible ceiling, especially at his price tag. In the last two games, he's had 46 and 36 fantasy points, and it's not like Providence is this super stout interior defensive team. So I kind of do like Eric Dixon, and I think that you can play something like a Carter Dixon stack if you want to get your top plays from this game. I think that's a viable strategy. Now after him, we got to talk about Justin Moore. So Justin Moore had coming into the season was Villanova's best player, like undisputably their best player. He got hurt, around the start of December and took a month off, and he really just wasn't the same after that month off. Well, what we're starting to see is like he's just not the same high usage player since returning from injury. In fact, he's only been over a 20% usage rate once in 6 games since returning from injury. However, he's starting to play more minutes. He played 40 minutes against Butler, played 33 against Marquette. He's starting to contribute a little bit more from fantasy scoring because of his assist rate. And so maybe I think it might be time to start putting Justin Moore back into lineups. A salary of only $5,200, knowing he's their best player, like I think there's a little bit of upside there. I wouldn't recommend him as a cash game play, but I think that eventually we're going to see a big time game from Justin Moore, because he is a big time player. He's just got to get back healthy. Now, a lot of that usage that Moore vacated went to TJ Bamba, who has been very good recently, but he's very shot dependent. He had 34 fantasy points against Marquette, but 24 real points. So I just don't really like playing guys like that. Guys like, AJ Storr at Wisconsin. I mentioned him on the podcast before. I just don't like playing guys where a lot of their fantasy scoring is tied to how much they score. So could Bamba get there? Yeah. But do I want to go there? Probably not. Mark Armstrong is a guy that I do want to mention. He had a 30% usage rate in 33 minutes played against Marquette. He took 18 shots. He only hit 5 of them, but he put up 36 fantasy points. He played significantly more minutes than Longino and Hart. And if that's going to continue, then he's a guy that needs to be in your lineups. And that's a situation worth monitoring going forward is who is getting the minutes at, the third guard spot between Armstrong, Hart, and Longino. And if it does end up being Armstrong, Armstrong is the guy that has the best rates. Next up, we have the UAB and SMU game that is not included on the FanDuel slate, but is on DraftKings. And, I've kind of been an advocate for this in the last few weeks, but put American Athletic, put A10 teams, put Mountain West teams, put Missouri Valley teams, put these good mid-major conferences on the slates. They're a lot of fun to watch. They're a lot of fun to track. And people who follow and watch all levels of college basketball are going to have an advantage by doing so. Am I a little bit biased, being a graduate of a school in the AAC? Maybe. My dad graduated from school in the A10, so I'm watching those two conferences on almost a nightly basis. So I do feel like I have a little bit of a knowledge advantage for those two conferences. But anyway, we've got UAB taking on SMU in this one. And KenPom has this one projected to finish as 79-68 in favor of SMU. The UAB side is a really interesting one because when you look at their usage rates over the course of the season, their highest usage rate belongs to Alejandro Vasquez, and he generally gets a lot of shots. He is their most ball dominant player when he's in the game. But the thing that limits him is his minutes. When you look at his game log, he has 20 or 32 in his most recent game, and then 20, 22, 25, and 32 minutes played in his last 5. And there's no real rhyme or reason to it. He can get himself in foul trouble, but very rarely fouls out. And so when you look at it, he generally gets a lot of shots, but the games where he's hit value have been the 2 games where he played 32 minutes. Against Tulane, he had 38.5 fantasy points. Against North Texas, he had 28.5 fantasy points. So I'm inclined to play guys like this just because I think that a lot of the general public that doesn't have access to usage rate numbers doesn't see that this guy is actually a ball dominant player who has a really high ceiling. And I think that if he does end up playing 30 minutes, I think he's going to absolutely smash. We just don't know if he's going to get there. So I think he's a pretty solid GPP play in my opinion. Now, the 2 guys that are a little more consistent are Lindeborg and Gaines. They're second and third on the team in usage. Eric Gaines is a guy that we've talked about before. He has a massive ceiling. In the last 4 games, he's had 3 games over 30 fantasy points, 2 games over 39 fantasy points, and he does it a lot in the peripheral stats. He isn't entirely shot dependent. This is a profile that I like playing, and I think that necessarily you don't have to just play Gaines or Vasquez. I think you can stack both of them together because Gaines generally excels more at the peripheral stats, whereas Vasquez is more of a scorer. Lindeborg is like this, athletic power forward that they have who has immense upside. Like in the last 5 games, he's had 2 games over 40 fantasy points. He's also had 2 games under 20 fantasy points. So you don't really know what you're going to get from Lindeborg, but I can't recall how many. I wish I could had a list of how many guys that I've said this exact statement against, or exact statement about, I should say. Lindeborg is a guy that his ceiling is so high. If you play multiple lineups in GPPs, you have to get him in your player pool. You just have to because you never know when he's going to go off for 50 or 40 or anything like that. So he's a guy that if you're playing multiple lineups, which I will be, you got to get him in your lineup at some point just because if he does go off, like he does have the potential to break the slate. After that, like you've got Javian Davis and Ephraim Johnson who play a lot of minutes, but their usage rates aren't really all that high. They don't generally take a whole lot of shots. And so I'm kind of like off of the two of them for that reason. But like they're going to be out there on the floor. They're going to be playing a ton of minutes. Like in their last game, Ephraim Johnson played 40 minutes against North Texas, put up 28 fantasy points. But that's kind of an outlier performance for him. So I think they're guys that, if you want to try and kind of be strategic and fade Lindeborg, Dave, or Gaines or Vasquez, I think you can get Davis and Johnson in there, but I'm not super high on them. Coleman and Ortiz are the really primary 2 guys that play off the bench. Tony will play a little bit as well. I'm not super interested in them just because they don't really have a ton of upside. But if you were to see foul trouble from one of the starting 5, you could see boosted minutes from Coleman, Ortiz, or Tony. Now, on the SMU side, it feels like just yesterday we were talking about them because it was like probably 2 or 3 nights ago because I believe they were on the Thursday slate. Zurich Phelps is their guy. He has a 27% usage rate on the season, which leads the team, and he had a 29% usage rate against Tulane. He had it, from my perception watching the game, it felt like the ball was always in his hands, right? Like he had 15, 5, and 5. He took 19 shots and he only made 5 of them. Like if he just went 8 for 19, he could have absolutely smashed the entire slate. So I love the upside of Zurich Phelps. I love how much the ball is in his hands. I think he's a very solid play against a UAB team that is a pace-up spot for SMU. Chuck Harris is your pivot off of Zurich Phelps. He significantly trailed Phelps in usage against Tulane, only put up 16.5 fantasy points. But when you go game by game in the game log, when Phelps doesn't get there, Harris does. So I think that Harris is most commonly going to be used as a direct pivot off of Phelps. And in my opinion, that is how I would use him. I would probably not play the 2 of them together. A guy that I mentioned on the Thursday show, and I don't do this very often, but I was kind of right about, was Samuel Williamson. I mentioned how he does his best in pace-up games, and Tulane was a pace-up game for them, and he put up 35 fantasy points with a double-double, 10 and 13. Well, to me, this is another opportunity for, SMU to be in a pace-up game against UAB. Samuel Williamson has a chance to absolutely smash it again. He's not super-duper consistent, but the upside is definitely there. One thing that is interesting for SMU is they did move Tyreek Smith into the starting lineup for that game against Tulane, and I thought he was great in that game. He was 8 for 9 from the field, put up 31 fantasy points. The downside is this: he still split minutes with Keon Ambrose Hilton. Like, Smith was moved into the starting lineup, but it's not like their ratio of minutes like changed a whole lot with that move. So I just think Smith is playing better though. So I really do like Smith. And if I were to play one of the SMU big men, it would probably be Tyreek Smith over Keon Ambrose Hilton. Now, out of the other options, like BJ Edwards starts but doesn't really play a whole lot. Jalen Smith generally comes off the bench and does play a lot, but both of them were outshined on Thursday night by Ricardo Wright. He had a great game out of nowhere against Tulane, played 21 minutes, was 5 for 12 from the field, 3 for 8 from behind the arc, put up 20 fantasy points. Like, that's really good for a guy who's 3,900. And on a DraftKings slate where there's not a whole lot of value to be had, I kind of feel the same way about him that I do about Corey Floyd Jr. Like, I'm going to be throwing him out there in some lineups just because there's not a whole lot of guys at this price point who have legitimate 5X upside, which he just showed us in that game against Tulane. All right, so that does it for the first half of the slate. Let's go ahead and take a quick breather, and then let's talk about the second 2. Hey y'all, if you're watching this on YouTube, unfortunately we're not going to have the video part for the last 2 games of the video. For whatever reason, my laptop disconnected from Wi-Fi in the middle of me recording the segment, and it didn't tell me, and so it just messed up the screen record, just messed everything up, and I can't get it back. So what you're going to have for the second half of this video is kind of just a blank screen, and then the audio of what I was saying about the last 2 games. So I do apologize for this. I'm trying to figure out how it happened, but it just sometimes technology just doesn't do us any favors, right? So hopefully, you guys can still get the information that you need from the audio, but there won't be any video from here to the rest of the video. Sorry, guys. Piece of good news about this slate is it does not appear as if we have a whole lot of wait and see injury situations. Like, there's not really anybody with a questionable tag. There's not really a whole lot of injuries of guys that are out that we have to worry about either. So this is shaping up to be a pretty straightforward slate. Now, I say that and like knock on wood because like it is college basketball, things do happen, but it's looking like we're not going to be super affected by injuries here on this Sunday slate. So Nebraska and Illinois are actually kind of both in situations where they have everybody back. They are our third game of the night. KenPom has this one projected to be 83-74 in favor of Illinois. Now, one thing you got to keep in mind with this Nebraska team is they are just a super different team on the road. More on that in a second. Now, Juwan Gary was the big injury news for them earlier in the week, and he came back against Wisconsin, played 33 minutes off the bench, put up 16.5 fantasy points. Didn't look all that bad. I'm curious to see if they're going to move him back into the starting lineup. I'm curious to see if he's going to play another 33 minutes here against Illinois. That's just something kind of interesting. I do think he's at a very affordable price tag at $5,300. Now, for Nebraska on the season, Rink Mast, their big man, and Bryce Williams, their point guard, do lead the team in usage on the season, and they're guys that I think both have a lot of potential, both have a really high ceiling. Mast had a 60 fantasy point outing a week ago. Bryce Williams is a guy who just, fills it up in the peripheral stats and has many ways to accumulate fantasy points. So those two guys I'm definitely considering. In that game against, who did they beat? They beat somebody good. Hold on, let me check it. They beat Wisconsin. Yeah, I should have remembered that. In that game, they beat Wisconsin. C.J. Wilcher was their leading scorer off the bench, 7 for 10 from the field, put up 22 real points and 32 fantasy points. I kind of think that's a ceiling game, and I don't necessarily want to chase it. Now, we mentioned this team is better at home, right? Well, that game against Wisconsin was at home. This game is on the road, and so I went back and looked at their game logs on the road, and buddy, this is a team that is not very successful from a fantasy perspective or a winning perspective on the road this season. Rink Mast has played 5 road games since Thanksgiving, and he has been over 4x value for this current price tag in 1 of them, 1 out of 5. Bryce Williams, a little bit better, has played 6 true road games since Thanksgiving and has been over 4x value in 3 of them. So 3 out of 6, that's 50%. The value plays are really poor, though. C.J. Wilcher has not hit 4x value in a road game since Thanksgiving. Juwan Gary has only done so in 1. Keize Tominaga has done so in 3, but he's a player who is very shot dependent and kind of like who was it that I mentioned earlier? TJ Bamba. I don't necessarily like playing guys like him that are very shot dependent and don't do a whole lot in the peripheral stats. And then Jamarcus Lawrence does have 1 4x game since Thanksgiving that was on the road. So really, if you play these guys like with how bad they've been on the road, you're kind of taking a little bit of an inherent risk in doing so. Now, I do think that this game is pretty stackable with it having 157 point total. So I do think that you can play options on this Nebraska side, but just know that on the road, they're a different team. Now, on the Illinois side, they have Terrence Shannon Jr. Finally back, and I think he is finally back from not only an availability standpoint, but like a usage and like just kind of game flow standpoint as well. So in their last game against Ohio State, Terrence Shannon Jr. played 32 minutes, put up 17 shots, 34% usage, 35 fantasy points. Game before that against Indiana, he dealt with a little foul trouble, but he still played 25 minutes, still put up 10 shots, 32% usage rate. So in back-to-back games, he's had a 32% and 34% usage rate. That is the Terrence Shannon Jr. that we were seeing from before he got injured, when he was putting up, 59 fantasy points against Missouri, 45 fantasy points against Rutgers. Like, he has the ability to absolutely fill it up. And that 35.75 that he had against Ohio State last week was the most that he has had in his return, or since his return from the suspension. So I do think Terrence Shannon Jr. is all the way back, and his price tag is not all the way back. So I'm going to hop on this price tag in where we can still take advantage of it at only $7,400. Now, while Shannon was out, Marcus Domask was really the guy for Illinois, and he's still been pretty good, even though Terrence Shannon Jr. is back. In the 4 games since Shannon's return, Domask has put up 30, 35, 37, and 29 fantasy points. So a 29-point ceiling from him, since Shannon has been back is pretty impressive. And he's still gotten to double-digit shots in all 4 of those games. So I do think that Marcus Domask is a guy that is fairly in play, even though I think Shannon, shapes up a little bit better. I think Domask is in play for me as well. Now, Coleman Hawkins has been a guy that has rode the roller coaster this season from a fantasy perspective. So, back in like early January, or I guess all the way back in December, really, he was back in like the $5,000 range, and he was just a supreme bargain. And then he kind of got quickly back up in the 7K range, and he was very briefly in the 9K range. And when you look at what he's done since Terrence Shannon Jr. got back, it just exemplifies that roller coaster. 38 against Rutgers. Okay, that's pretty doggone good. 49 against Northwestern. That's really good. 27 against Illinois. Yeah, that's okay. 10 fantasy points against Ohio State. So I just don't really know what to expect from him. The usage has not been there since Shannon has gotten back. However, he's never been a guy who has needed a high usage rate to put up a lot of fantasy points because he does so much in the peripheral stats like rebounds and blocks and steals. He tends to play his best when he's going up against like an on-ball big because he gets a lot of blocks and steals from that situation. And we have one of those this game in Rick Mast. So, Rick Mast also draws a lot of fouls though. So he could also find himself in foul trouble. Like, I don't really know what to expect with Hawkins. I don't think he's a safe play by any means. I think he's a GPP play, but I would rather just go $400 down and play Terrence Shannon Jr., who has more usage and has just as high, if not a higher ceiling. Now, Quincy Guerrier is a guy that's probably a cross-off for me. Since Shannon Jr. has gotten back 30, 31, okay, that's pretty good, right? But then the last two have been 10 and 7 fantasy points. He's just a pass for me at this point. I got to see him do it with Shannon in the lineup before I'm willing to go back to him. Justin Harmon and Luke Goody are also two guys who have seen their production lower significantly since Shannon Jr. got back in the lineup. I would just rather play other value plays. Ty Rodgers is an interesting case because he's an elite defensive player. Well, from my perception watching Illinois, I think he's a pretty good defensive player. Some guys on Illinois Twitter don't necessarily think so, but I think he's a pretty good defensive player. And when he plays a lot of minutes because they need his defense, he has pretty good fantasy outings, like when he put up 31 fantasy points against Ohio State. So I think he's an interesting play for that reason, but I think there's other plays in the 5K range that I would rather get to than Ty Rodgers. Now, last game of the night is going to be Stanford taking on Arizona. This is the nightcapped, tipping off at 8 p.m., which is significantly later than the other games on the slate. KenPom has this one projected as the widest margin in the slate. KenPom has it projected to be 89-72 in favor of Arizona, which makes Arizona the highest projected individual team on the slate, and this the highest projected game on the slate. But that margin, that means that this is a game that has significant blowout potential, and we're going to talk about what that means here in just a second. So in their last game, Stanford got ceiling games from Brandon Angel as well as Michael Jones. Brandon Angel put up a double-double, put up 14 shots, put up 33 fantasy points. That's really good for him. And then Michael Jones also had a really solid game shooting the ball, was 5 for 7 from behind the arc, put up 26.5 fantasy points. So those two guys, I'm probably not going to chase the ceiling games from them. What I would rather do is follow the usage, and a guy that's having a lot of usage right now is Maxime Reynaud. I think he's a bargain on FanDuel where he's much cheaper, but you look at what he's done recently and he's just been really good. He hasn't been shot dependent either because he's been rebounding the ball at such an insane rate. He's had double doubles in 4 of his last 5 games, and I think the chance is there to do that again against Arizona. What he needs to do, though, is he needs to not get in foul trouble against the bigs of Arizona. If he can stay out on the floor, Maxime Reynaud has a chance at a ceiling game because Arizona is going to play at a fast tempo, the 11th fastest in the nation, and they are going to increase the number of possessions in this game, which is going to increase the number of opportunities that Reynaud can get rebounds, and which could be very lucrative from him. But he has to be on the floor to get those opportunities, and he's got to stay out of foul trouble. I do like him a lot as a play. The other guy I like a lot is going to be Kanan Carlisle. So, like I said about Landeborg earlier, he's a guy that if you play enough GPP lineups, you got to get him out there in one of them because he just has these games where he randomly has like a 40% usage rate and puts up, 46 fantasy points against Arizona like he did earlier in the season, or, puts up 37 fantasy points against Oregon State or 37 against Washington State. And so that is, a guy that you definitely have to consider. Last game was a little bit of a dud for him. He only played 16 minutes against Arizona State, put up 7 fantasy points. What happened in that one, Stanford is a team that I've watched enough of them to know that when you get 2 fouls in the first half, their coach will just yank you and like just you're not going to play again until after halftime. And what happened with Carlisle was, he picked up that second foul with about 8 minutes to go in the first half, and then Benny Giler got into the game and played well. So Benny Giler kind of took more minutes in the second half for that reason as well. Giler played 20 minutes in that game against Arizona State and put up 17 fantasy points, and at a price tag of $3,800, that's really good. So I think that Giler would make sense as a pivot off of Kaden Carlisle. But remember, Carlisle also had a lot of success against Arizona in that first game with that 46 fantasy point performance. I neglected to mention it, but Maxime Reynaud in that first game against Arizona only put up 28.75 fantasy points, but he only took 7 shots in that game, only played 24 minutes, because it appears as if he had 3 fouls in that game, so he might have dealt with foul trouble a little bit. It was a while ago, so I don't remember when he picked up those 3 fouls, but if he can stay on the floor, he's still got a really good chance. So that's pretty much all I'm considering from the Stanford side. With the Arizona side, you have to take into account what could happen if the game stays close, or what could happen if the game is a blowout. If the game stays close, Caleb Love could absolutely smash. He is their usage leader on the season, and he puts up fantasy points in bunches. He puts up fantasy points in a lot of ways. In that first game against Stanford, he put up 33 fantasy points, which would be pretty good at his current salary. And he's a guy that I would absolutely be willing to play, but if I'm playing Caleb Love, I'm probably playing some Stanford guys on the other side because I probably want the game to stay close, right? I don't want to end up with a situation where, you end up like what happened against Cal, where Caleb Love only played 29 minutes and only put up 29 fantasy points because they were up 25 at halftime. So that's a situation that you got to keep in mind. Kashad Johnson was kind of a victim of that as well. He only played 27 minutes against Cal, only put up 23 fantasy points. He had 19 fantasy points in that first game against Stanford. Pelly Larson is a wing who can fill up the stat sheet in a variety of ways. But again, you're noticing a trend here. Only played 28 minutes against Cal because it was a blowout. Only put up 14 fantasy points. And in that first game against Stanford, he did have 21 fantasy points as well. So, who can you play if you think it's going to be a blowout? Well, Umar Ballo did get there against Cal on only 22 minutes. He played 22 minutes against Cal, put up 22 and 13, 42 total fantasy points. And oh, by the way, in that first game against Stanford, he only played 24 minutes, only put up 22 fantasy points. But we know that he has the ability to get there in playing only 22 minutes because he just did it against Cal. So Umar Ballo, out of all the top Arizona guys, I think he is the safest play because he has shown the ability this season to hit value in games that are both close and blowouts, and so he would be like my number one play on this Arizona side. Kylan Boswell is intriguing as well. So he's been kind of struggling over the last month, but he did get a little bit of extended run against Cal from the rest of the starters. He played 29 minutes, put up 20 fantasy points, which we will take for a guy for his salary. Had 25 fantasy points against Oregon in the game before that was a little closer, but the Stanford game was a game where he kind of started his struggles, right? He only put up 12 fantasy points in 31 minutes, was 2 for 11 from the field. I think he's a boomer bust option that I'm willing to play, but I'm definitely not going to play in cash games. I'm definitely not going to go all in on him either. Now, the blowout crew for Arizona. There are 3 guys that, if a game turns into a blowout for Arizona, are going to see extended run, are going to have opportunities to put up a lot of fantasy points. And against Cal, KJ Lewis only played 16 minutes, but he played a lot in the second half, put up 23.5 fantasy points at a salary of $4,800. We love that. Mateus, I hope I'm saying that correctly, Krivas, played 16 minutes against Cal, put up 11 fantasy points. He's shown the ability to get there in blowouts. And then Jaden Bradley, similar situation, only played 16 minutes against Cal, but put up 13 fantasy points. So if you're banking on this game turning into a blowout, out of the Arizona starters, Ballo can still get there, but Lewis, Krivas, and Bradley have to be in your player pool if you think that it's going to be a blowout, because those 3 are going to be the ones that see extended run. All right, so I'm hoping that was able to give you kind of a bird's eye view of this Stanford-Arizona game, because whether or not that game is close or a blowout is probably going to be the story of the slate, because that's a game that you can either stack or a game that you could have guys that absolutely torpedo your lineup if you play them and they're not out in the game in the second half. So we was able to give you guys plenty of paint a picture there to give you guys the ability to make your lineups around that game. All right, so that does it for our Sunday, February 4th college basketball DFS preview. If you like what you saw on YouTube, please hit the like button. It helps me out a lot. And please subscribe to the channel, and you can be with us for the rest of college basketball season all the way up until that national championship game in April. If you're listening on audio, you can subscribe to the audio feed as well. You can also rate and review the podcast. That helps me out a ton. And if you want more information from me, there are places that you can get it. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. The Fantasy Corner Discord is where I will be chatting it up all day long, talking plays, talking strategy, and then sweating it out. But because basically in the Fantasy Corner Discord, we've got a lot of smart people in there who have had a lot of money or a lot of success recently, in college basketball DFS, and we're in there talking all day long. So if you're looking for people to talk college basketball DFS with, join the Fantasy Corner Discord. I promise it's a good time and it can help you get better. And we've had a lot of guys in there that have been kind of knocking on the door, with the potential for a big GPP win multiple times this week. And one of these days, these guys are going to break the door down. So, if you want to get in on the action, join the Fantasy Corner Discord. Lastly, I do write articles to my Patreon for every college basketball slate where I highlight my core plays as well as kind of my lineup strategy and attack strategy for each slate. There's not a whole lot of people out there doing this for college basketball. I'm not going to sit there and guarantee that, you can just, plug them in and immediately win GPPs. It's not that easy, but I do think you can use it to get a lot of good information to start your lineups off on and get some strategy and some advice to kind of build your own process and get better at college basketball DFS. All right, so that does it for the Sunday slate preview. That does it for this episode, y'all. Hopefully I was able to give you guys plenty of information that is going to allow you to build some winning DFS lineups for this Sunday slate. I do plan on being back for the Monday slate, so make sure you hit that subscribe button and join us again tomorrow night, or I guess if you're watching this on Sunday, tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon, because I am sitting here recording this on a Saturday night. So hopefully I was able to give you guys what you needed here this episode. Best of luck to you on DraftKings and FanDuel tomorrow. Thank you guys for watching and listening to this point, and I will see you next time.